Okay, we're going to be starting a new book. We're going to go through 1 Thessalonians. If you want to go and open up your Bibles. We're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time actually digging into the scriptures tonight, this afternoon. We're going to look at an overview, kind of put it historically in its perspective and the reason and kind of theme of the book, and I'll look at the structure of the book, and hopefully we'll have a better understanding of it. I think Thessalonians, they're little letters. There's first and second, and sometimes it's easy to misplace them and where they are in the relationship to other letters, and historically as well. Where is Thessalonica? You know, when you think about that, a lot of times we hear that. But at Thessalonica, now Corinth, I know for me, if you say Corinth, bam, I can do that. Jerusalem, I can get that one. But some of these you think about and you go, wow, okay, I know the name because there's a letter in the Bible, but like Galatia is not one specific location. It's a regional area. So it does kind of help us to understand this and the motive behind the writing, because when you start to take it apart, it's so important to always remember, why is he writing it? To who is he writing into it? What is their relationship? And what was he trying to get the big picture on it? So let's start with the geographic location. When we look at where it's at, it's way up in the Macedonian region of the top of Greece there, if you look at it. And it has an interesting location that played a big role in it. This is the second missionary journey. Paul, on his first one, he kind of stayed in that Galatia, and you see that area there, what they call Asia Minor, this larger portion. But the second one, he goes off, and they really goes into what they call Europe. That's kind of weird to me. Europe is Germany and all that, but that's actually, when you look at this side of where he goes, it starts to go into the European continent. And so that's what's kind of unique when we look at where he's at. So when we zoom in a little bit, and we kind of look, you can see that where Thessalonica is at. And when he traveled across from Troas, we can see his journey across. He first comes to Philippi, and then after Philippi, and recognize that? Philippians. So there's a letter there. And then over here to Thessalonica. And that is an interesting port when we look at it. One of the things that we see is that it was the largest Roman province, the city in the province of Macedonia. Now, if I was to slide that map down a little bit, you could really clearly see, if you're going to travel by land and just stick to land and you don't want to go by water, well, this is a route many would go to travel backwards from the way I just showed you, the way Paul did. So it became very important. And so to the Romans, and when Rome made a city of importance like this, it's kind of like the most favored nation. You know, you had a status that no other city had. You got blessings from the empire. You were able to build temples, and that's some of the problems as well sometimes because of the culture. But it also then makes it like a large city of diverse cultures that are traveling, coming and going, similar to when you look at like New York City. Whenever you look at like Los Angeles, you see those cities are different from Boise, Iowa. Where's Boise, Iowa? You know, it's like, well, somewhere in the United States somewhere, but it's culturally kind of secluded. So that's something about as well. It served as the center for trade and commerce. If you also look close, you notice that it's got an inlet. So there's a really good protected port. So ships could come in there as well. So not only by land, but also by sea, you could come in and have merchandise and things come into that Macedonian region. This is also the area where Alexander the Great came from, in this northern part of Macedonia. So that's just another side note of it. But the importance of it was pretty significant when we think about it. Let's look at the history. When did it start? And this is where sometimes we study the book of Acts like we're doing on Sunday morning, and then we just read through it historically, but we forget about, well, wait a minute, we recognize the names again in Acts, but then we go, well, okay, what was going on there? There's something else. And then you go, oh, that's right, we got a letter in our Bible to this location. So let's look at the start of the church here and read through there. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, and there was a synagogue of the Jews, and they went in, and as was his custom, that on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them for scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great number of devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, and they set the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring him out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of his brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things, and when they had taken money as security from Jason, and the rest, they let him go. Quick. I mean, when we look at that, and then when we look at 10, we see the departure in Acts 17:10. And the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, and when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now, 2 things real quick. First off, when he got in town, where'd he go? To the synagogue. And then when he departs and leaves and he gets into Berea, where does he go? Go to the synagogue. Because they had something in common. That's the way the gospel spread. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Sound familiar? But one thing you see is we have 3 of them together. We have Paul, Silas, and Timothy. You notice that it's Silas and Paul who depart. And Timothy sticks around there. So that's something. So where did he write this? Well, after he had a more positive experience in Berea, he then travels, and eventually we'll just skip down to where he lands. He lands in Corinth. And Corinth, he stays there for like 2 years. So from there, he's doing a lot of letter writing, a lot of evangelistic work there in Corinth. This is one of the earliest letters. That's what's really fascinating. Galatians is also a very early letter to Paul. When we were talking about this morning on the manuscripts and stuff, and you look at the date from the time he wrote it to the copy that currently exists that we can look at, these are some of the most profound copies that are so close to when Paul wrote it. It's just, there's nothing comparing to it. And so, as well as Thessalonica here, this letter that went to them, about 20 years go by. So it's pretty fascinating, which again shows the literacy, the credibility of the letters to the original writer anyway. So around 52 AD is when it was written. And now think about even Jesus, when Jesus was crucified. We're talking 33 AD. So just between the time of crucifixion to the time that he wrote this letter, think about the witnesses and all the people that were still alive, and why we can see where Paul talks that there's still of them alive that watched him after he was dead. You can go talk to him, because look at the dates and you see that how much evidence there was for people to look at and understand. So I'm going to use something kind of different. It's this from Bible Projects. They develop these videos and stuff, but I'm going to try to not go through it too much. I don't think I can do the same justice. If you want Bible Project, they can do great overviews of it, and then that's all we're going to do. I want us to capture this kind of this basic essence of the letter and understanding it. And as I talked about, first off, the very beginning of it was the genesis of why in the start of the church was over this idea again that there was another king. And the sad part is he was there only a month. How many Sabbaths? 3 Sabbaths. Just 1 month. And there's another fascinating thing, I think, as far as the amount of time that he spent there, the intensity that we'll see with their relationships. But, of course, eventually what happens is when people don't agree with you and they can't beat you logically, remember that's something that we read in Acts, that they could not refute him. And when people get to that point, either they're going to become a Christian and accept, or they're going to turn against you. And that seems to be the response. And not only, remember the idea, the way that they had stated the effect of what they were doing, there seems to have some knowledge of what Paul has done in his first missionary journey and what is going on in the effect of this group of people who have splintered off from the Jewish belief. Now, that's the way the world's looking at it, is that these Jews got a problem. They had this guy named Jesus, and he lived in Nazareth, and Nazarene, and he died, and they executed him because he was a criminal. And so they're looking at this problem more of a Jewish, and that's the way the Romans looked at it. They looked at it as an internal religious conflict within them, and these people, Christos, those people following that Christ. And so that message had already come around. But they also, part of that message was the effect it was having on cities. Their confession alone is almost telling you the power of the gospel. They say that they've turned the world upside down. That's right. The gospel turned the world upside down, and the world has never been the same since. They cannot erase this guy. This guy, Jesus, if they want to just look at him as a historical figure, you can see that the proof is there. They turned the world upside down, and that's what he says. Then they brought that here. But the hatred became so intense that they had to flee, and the brothers basically got him out. You know, Paul didn't run away a lot. In Ephesus one time, I mean, they beat him down, stoning, drag him out of the city. He gets back up and goes back in. It's like, wow, I take a beating, Ron's on the next bus out of town. I'm that, you know, I mean, most people would, he got up and he went back. So I thought about that in relationship to here in Thessalonica, the fact that he didn't. He left. Him and Silas take off and they go. So when we look at the first verses in this book, we see the idea of verses 6 through 10 in describing what they were, the condition that they had before when he got there. Now remember what I talked about the way Thessalonica was, that it was a center hub of a Roman culture in many ways. And so a lot of idol worship. Greek gods, they merged with the Roman gods, and so there was all sorts of paganism going on, very deep in the culture. I mean, I can think of some really bad cities that you can think about, some of the morality that is so ingrained in those cities that if you were to go there and try to preach the gospel, the effect that it would have. But he reminds them how they turned away. They turned away from those idols. And I like the way he describes an idol by giving them, describing their choice was to a true God, a living God, that they walked away. And after a while, I mean, if you walked around and you lived there long enough and you worshiped idols, you'd realize they don't do anything. They don't talk to you. They're really not helping you. It's cold, it's dead, it's not real. And so they turned away. And so the part that they're waiting for in this hope and this conversion also is a message throughout the book that's being dealt with, and especially then he'll re-deal with it some more in the second letter, is the return of God's Son when he comes here the next time. But that relationship, when he talks about how that they had established it in just one short month, I think what is so powerful is how they had built this. He uses some beautiful, intimate idioms in talking about their relationship. He calls himself, you know, their father, like a father and a mother, a parental relationship, and that in a way that he was their child and the way they shared it. And so in describing that 1 month about how close they had become to one another, and that, as he says in chapter 2, verse 8, he says, we are happy to share not only the good news, what we did, but we shared our lives. And what does that mean to you when you say you share you share your life? To me, you expose yourself. You open up and you're honest about every aspect. You share memories, you share your shortcomings, and that makes it personable and makes it really close. And they became very close in that. And so that is what helped cause this deep love that Paul had for them, and very deep concern as well. And so they shared something unique that helped to bond them as well. And that was this persecution. The persecution that he experienced when he became a Christian, and then also the persecution that they are. And so that suffering, he's saying, is a way of participating in the story of Jesus. Because how did we get what we have? Well, it was through persecution. It was through this type of trial. And so this common theme of persecution and victory is what he's trying to get them to see. that Paul was persecuted, he's victorious. But his Messiah was persecuted, and he was victorious. Now, it depends on how you judge victorious, because in the world's eyes, they killed him. But that's not the end of it. That's the whole point. It's going towards that everlasting life that he is trying to get them to focus on. And, you know, the concern then pours out the next part of the letter, where he is so concerned about them and about their suffering that he then resends Timothy to go back to them and find out what's going on. You have that type of relationship, you're very concerned. And you can imagine, how fast could they get information? It is pretty slow. I mean, they didn't have any mode of transporting any faster than the foot or a ship, maybe a chariot. So he wanted to know that. But what he found was, instead of a bunch of people that had been beat down and lost their faith, what did he find? He found people that are strong. They were strong in their faith, and they were being persecuted pretty heavy, and it's going to weigh on them even more. That's going to help set the stage for the next letter. But the opposite was going on. And this is the thing with the gospel that you see, is every time that they've tried to persecute Christ's disciples, that it's had the opposite reaction. We start with the disciples, the apostles in Jerusalem, when they were brought before the council, tried to repress them. Didn't stop them. It kept growing. You know, when they dispersed the church and killing Stephen, didn't stop them, man. It just continued to grow, and then it spread. So this is what we see, the way the gospel is going and what he's kind of showing, and that's what was so beautiful about the response he got back. He needed that encouragement, because what did he do? He turns them into Christians, and he runs, and he leaves them. So you can see his anguish in saying, oh, you know, I've left you out there. I'm so concerned, and wanting to help them. And it so must have been a beautiful message coming back and saying, Timothy going, hey, man, they got it. They're doing great. And that they miss him, that they're really looking for them. So the second part of the book, he transitions by a prayer, which is very amazing the way he crafts this, is praying for endurance, which is perfect because that's what they're needing. That's what we need. We need a prayer for endurance for what's going on in our lives. And he prays and he says, increase your love, holiness, and hope. Those, what's interesting, which it's not too crazy to think, I mean, if that's what he's praying, that's what he's thinking, then that's what he's going to talk about. So this is kind of that bridge, is a prayer. We know that we've already seen where Paul has these moments where he just breaks out in prayer. He becomes so emotional and spiritual that he will start and pray. And love, holiness, and hope. Those are going to be the three things he's going to talk about in the last part of the book as we go through this. Now, the first part, as he goes, is looking at this idea of holiness. Holiness and being pure. One of the biggest challenges was immorality that was going on. And the idea that pulling away from what was very normal to them, a lot of the perverse sexual habits that were going on, and it was pretty bizarre. It was not uncommon for husbands to not only have a mistress and go out to some house that was, prostitutes, but then also you had temple prostitution. And then, so you could see the corruption of what the marriage life was. And so that's one of the focuses that he's wanting them to understand, is a part of your strength is going to be taking what God had intended and bringing it back to the model of marriage and the way it should be. And so he's really encouraging them in the first part of 4 about that idea of following Jesus' teaching on sex and marriage. And then he talks about the relationship when it comes to being in the community. And that must be hard, because it's really hard to be out there and being positive when every time you turn around, people are beating you up and trying to kill you. But one of the things he's encouraging them to do is commit to love and service. Not just love, but put that into action. This is where a lot of times we fall short, I think, is we say we love, but then we don't put it into action. And he wants them to go out. Now, that's one of the greatest ways you can take the gospel, is to take the gospel out, is to not only just show your love and say you love, but to show your love through service and that action. And be generous as well. The effect that it has when people see that. This is one of the observations that historians that weren't part of the church that document about those Christians was one, how obedient they were to the government. The other thing was how well and what a good citizen they were of their communities. They weren't out there doing violent protests and things. They were solid, loving, good servants in their community. And that's another key thing that we'll talk about how we need to model that in our lives as well. But one of the concerns that come up, because probably they had already had some Christians die and probably suffered martyrdom. I mean, if Paul and Silas had to leave town so quickly and the tempo of violence that was building up against them, some of them, because one of the questions that he deals with is talking about the resurrection and after death. And it's really neat the way that he does this is because he uses something historically, culturally that they would understand. Very similar to the way we would use, our government structure or certain functions that we do in a government to try to make an application. And he does this by talking about the way that an emperor would come to town, or the Caesar, same thing, emperor, would come to town. And prior to them arrival, one of the customs was that town would send out envoys, go out and greet the emperor and his entourage. I bet you it was huge, massive, when they traveled. You just look at the way our president travels. The big, huge entourage that comes with him. That they would send out ambassadors and people to go greet them before they got into town. And he uses this as our king is coming. And those that have gone on are basically kind of those first ones that are going to be there greeting him and going forward. And we'll talk more because he gets a little more detailed about the resurrection. So the same type of deal, the Caesar type of arrival met by his delegates, and the way he says, this is kind of what we're seeing. You're going to see our king come and be greeted and met by his people as well as they journey in. He uses kind of a play on words, which I think is kind of a play on a concept that propaganda that the Romans tried to put out. And one of the, every government's got their propaganda. But one of their propagandas was there's peace and security in the empire. But to what cost? And this is why it's so fascinating the way that Paul is able to take a concept of government structure that they were aware of and then show in contrast the beauty of the kingdom that we're a part of and that is everlasting. Was this idea that the way that their propaganda was peace and security, and it's a Caesar who's maintaining this. You are blessed to be in the Roman Empire. Yeah, but at what cost? Well, when you looked at it, it was an army of occupation. It was through slavery. It was through oppression. You were fine just as long as you obeyed, you submitted. And it was a brutal type of rule as well. And he's like, you know what? This is not going to be the same. Matter of fact, when our Lord returns, they're going to be destroyed. They're preaching a false propaganda. The message that you've received is something that is powerful and real, and that when he arrives, you're going to see a huge difference. So you need to live that it's present. And this is where the way Paul describes, and we're going to have to deal with this as we get into it, is the idea of when is he coming? When is he coming? And the idea of it coming soon and all of these ideas and the last days, and that gets warped around. But his point of this is live now as if he's here. He's coming. Because do you have another breath? Can anybody? Do you know? And as far as you know, once we're gone, it's going to, next thing we know, he's returning and the dead will rise. So we need to not focus upon the propaganda of the world and focus upon the reality of our King and his coming and be excited about that. He wraps it up in a final as a prayer. There are 3 prayers. He starts out with a prayer. He transitions from the first section to that middle prayer that establishes what he's going to talk about. And then he brings it back about this idea that may God keep you holy as you await the arrival of Jesus. This is the whole thing. Holding on, be enduring throughout this whole time so that you can then be ready for when the Lord returns. And so it's a prayer of hope. So he has a prayer of endurance in the middle and a prayer of hope. The beginning was a prayer of thanks. So 3 prayers. Paul always seems to put these in so beautifully as he comes in. So if we think about one of the aspects that he's showing here is that by becoming and following Jesus, we created what I would call a counterculture. And when I say counterculture, it's against the culture that exists in the world. And when you become a part of this counterculture, you are to be holy and have a holy way of life. And that is against, because the world and its culture is not holy. So we are that. And how do we respond to that is probably the most important, is that we respond in this way of life to hostility with love and generosity. Instead of fighting back and arming ourselves and going back and being violent about it, no. The way we respond to hostility is love and generosity. And why can we do that? What's your motivation, as we'd say? What's your motivation? It's motivated by the hope of the coming of him, of Jesus. That is what it's about. The ultimate idea is why are we so motivated to serve the Lord, be holy, be a part of this Christian counterculture, and stand strong, is because of this hope, because we know that he is coming again. So if we were to look at the theme, it would be honestly holiness, love, and the future hope. The future hope. Well, that's it, kind of in a rapid fire kind of thing. I hope that next week we're going to. Next week we'll get into the starting of the book. If you want to go ahead, now that you know we're going to be in 1 Thessalonians, go ahead and jump in there. Oh, my slide is messed up. I got second stuff. I just noticed that. We're not in second, it's first. Thessalonians, we'll get into it next week. So if you're with us this evening, whether you're online or you're with us this evening here in the building, we hope that you would always think about your relationship with your Lord and Savior. If there's anything that we can do to help you either establish that relationship in him and help you do that, or to help pray with you, to encourage you, we hope that you would consider that. And let your wishes be known while we either sing, and if not soon, let us know, and so we can help you. So think about this while we sing.
Out of my bondage, sorrow, and night, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come, into thy freedom, gladness, and light. Jesus, I come to thee. Out of my sickness into thy health, out of my want and into thy wealth, out of my sin and into thyself. Jesus, I come to thee. Out of my shameful failure and loss, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come, into thy glorious gain of thy cross. Jesus, I come to thee. Out of earth's